In this episode, we are moving into one of the most important activities in all of risk work, because a comprehensive information technology, IT, risk assessment is where an organization steps back, studies its environment carefully, and decides what could go wrong, why it could go wrong, and what that would mean for the business. For a brand new learner, this topic matters because risk assessment is not just a technical review, and it is not simply a meeting where people list everything that worries them. It is a disciplined process for understanding uncertainty in a way that supports better decisions, stronger controls, and more realistic priorities. When done well, it gives leaders a clearer view of their exposure and helps them focus on what actually matters instead of reacting to whichever issue sounds the loudest that week. That is why this activity sits so close to the center of sound governance, because without a thoughtful assessment, the organization may spend money, attention, and effort in the wrong places while the most important risks remain poorly understood. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to understand what a risk assessment really is and what it is not. A comprehensive IT risk assessment is a structured evaluation of threats, vulnerabilities, controls, likelihood, impact, and business context so the organization can judge where meaningful exposure exists and what response is appropriate. It is not the same as a vulnerability scan, a compliance checklist, or a simple list of technical weaknesses. Those things can contribute useful information, but an assessment goes further because it connects technical conditions to business services, operational dependencies, data sensitivity, leadership expectations, and the possible consequences of failure. A beginner sometimes imagines that the assessment begins and ends with computers, but the real focus is broader than that. The organization is trying to understand how people, processes, technology, vendors, and governance interact, because risk is usually created by the combination of those elements rather than by one isolated flaw sitting quietly on its own. Before the assessment can produce anything useful, the organization has to define its scope and purpose clearly. If the scope is too vague, the work becomes unfocused and teams may gather a large amount of information without answering the most important questions. If the scope is too narrow, significant dependencies and related exposures may remain outside the discussion even though they would strongly affect the business during a real event. A strong assessment therefore starts by asking what part of the environment is being reviewed, what business processes or services are involved, what systems and data support those activities, and what decisions the assessment is supposed to help inform. Sometimes the scope may cover a whole business unit, and sometimes it may focus on a major platform, a critical vendor relationship, or a set of essential business services. The important lesson is that the assessment should begin with a clear view of why the work is being done, what questions must be answered, and what boundaries will keep the effort practical while still meaningful. Once scope is clear, the next step is collecting and reviewing business and IT information that gives the assessment real substance. The organization needs to understand what it is trying to protect, what services are most important, what data is sensitive, which systems support critical work, and where dependencies exist across teams, platforms, and external providers. That means looking at process documentation, asset information, architecture views, incident history, vendor arrangements, control records, and prior findings, while also talking with people who understand how work is actually performed day to day. A mature assessment does not rely only on diagrams or formal records because those may be incomplete, outdated, or too polished to show where fragility really lives. For a beginner, this is an important habit to develop. Risk assessment becomes much stronger when the organization compares what the documents say with what staff members, managers, and technology owners know from operating the environment in the real world under deadlines, exceptions, and changing business needs. Criticality is another major part of a comprehensive assessment, because not every process, application, or data set deserves the same level of concern. Some systems support essential customer services, sensitive information, legal obligations, revenue generation, or operational continuity, while others are useful but not truly mission-critical. The assessment therefore has to identify what matters most and why. This includes understanding the business consequences of disruption, corruption, misuse, or unauthorized exposure, along with how quickly those consequences would become serious if something went wrong. A low-priority tool with weak controls may still deserve attention, but it may not require the same urgency as a critical service with only limited tolerance for downtime or data error. A beginner should notice that this part of the assessment is where business understanding becomes extremely important. Technical weakness alone does not determine priority. Priority comes from the combination of weakness and significance, which is why the same type of issue may deserve very different responses depending on the business process, timing, and data involved. Threat identification comes next, and this is where the organization begins examining what kinds of events or conditions could cause harm in the scoped environment. Threats may come from external attackers, dishonest insiders, careless actions, software defects, service provider failures, environmental disruption, infrastructure outages, or other operational breakdowns. The key is not to create the longest possible list of bad things. The key is to identify credible threat sources that make sense in the context of the organization's real environment, industry, operating model, and current technology landscape. A hospital, bank, manufacturer, and university may all face cyber threats, but the threats that matter most in each environment may differ because their data, processes, obligations, and tolerance for disruption are different. For new learners, it is important to remember that threat identification should be practical and grounded. A comprehensive assessment is not made better by adding every imaginable danger. It is made better by identifying the threat sources that could realistically interact with the organization's important assets, people, and processes in ways that create material business harm. Vulnerability identification adds another essential layer because threats become meaningful only when they encounter weaknesses that make harm easier to cause. Vulnerabilities may exist in technology, such as unsupported systems, weak configurations, poor visibility, or excessive access. They may exist in processes, such as weak approval steps, inconsistent reviews, poor change discipline, or incomplete offboarding. They may also exist in people-related areas, such as limited awareness, role confusion, over-reliance on a few individuals, or unsafe behavior that has become normalized over time. A strong assessment looks across all of those areas instead of treating vulnerability as a purely technical topic. That broader view matters because many serious events occur not because one technical flaw existed, but because a process weakness and a human weakness made the technical flaw much more exploitable. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest signs that comprehensive assessment is different from narrow technical testing. It asks where the organization is exposed across the full operating environment, not only where a tool can detect a visible system weakness. Existing controls must then be evaluated because exposure is not defined only by threats and vulnerabilities in isolation. The organization also needs to understand what safeguards, monitoring, approvals, recovery capabilities, training, and governance mechanisms are already in place that reduce the chance of a problem or limit the damage if one occurs. A control may be preventive, detective, corrective, or some combination, but the important question is whether it is appropriate and whether it is actually working in practice. This is where many assessments become shallow, because teams sometimes document controls as if the mere existence of a policy or process proves effectiveness. A more thoughtful assessment asks whether the control is operating consistently, whether evidence supports that conclusion, whether exceptions are growing, and whether the control still matches the current environment. For beginners, the main lesson is that control evaluation is not a paperwork exercise. It is an honest look at whether the organization's safeguards are genuinely reducing exposure or whether they only appear reassuring on the surface while important weaknesses remain untreated underneath. Once threats, vulnerabilities, and controls are understood, likelihood analysis becomes much more meaningful. Likelihood is the judgment about how plausible it is that a given risk event could occur in the organization's real environment, taking into account threat capability, exposure, control strength, frequency of opportunity, and historical patterns where those are relevant. This is not always about precise mathematics. Often it involves informed judgment supported by evidence and by discussion among people who understand the business, the systems, and the control environment. A risk may be technically possible while still being unlikely under current conditions, or it may be more likely than leadership assumes because a key weakness is exposed frequently and compensating controls are unreliable. For a beginner, it is useful to think of likelihood as disciplined plausibility rather than speculation. The assessment is asking how easy it would be for a harmful event to occur here, under these conditions, with these dependencies, and against this level of control maturity. That question helps move the conversation from generic fear toward practical evaluation that supports prioritization. Impact analysis follows closely, because the seriousness of a risk depends not only on whether an event could happen, but on what would happen to the business if it did. A comprehensive assessment examines financial, operational, reputational, legal, privacy, and sometimes safety consequences depending on the organization's industry and mission. It also considers time, because the harm from an outage, exposure, or process failure often grows as the event continues. A brief interruption during a quiet period may be manageable, while the same issue during peak customer demand or a critical reporting period may become severe very quickly. Strong impact analysis also asks who would be affected, which services would stop or degrade, what data would be involved, and how long the organization could tolerate the condition before consequences became unacceptable. For beginners, this is where business meaning becomes especially clear. A misconfiguration, software defect, or process gap matters only because of the harm it can cause. Once impact is understood, risk is no longer just a technical concern. It becomes a business decision about what consequences the organization is willing or unwilling to absorb. A comprehensive assessment also needs to connect those judgments into risk scenarios rather than leaving the findings as isolated facts. A good scenario explains how a threat could exploit a vulnerability in a specific context, what controls are already present, and what business consequence could result if the event occurred. This helps the organization move from scattered technical observations to a more realistic understanding of how harm could actually unfold. For example, instead of merely noting dependence on a third-party platform, a strong scenario might describe how a prolonged provider outage could disrupt a critical customer process because alternate handling methods are weak and staff have not practiced a fallback approach. That kind of scenario supports better discussion because leaders and operational teams can both see what is at stake. For a new learner, this is a valuable technique because scenarios turn the assessment into something more than a list of conditions. They show the chain from weakness to event to impact, which makes prioritization and communication much more effective. Prioritization is one of the most important outcomes of the assessment because no organization can address every issue at once with the same urgency. Once likelihood and impact are understood, and once the strength of existing controls has been considered, the organization needs to decide which risks require immediate treatment, which can be monitored, which may need escalation to leadership, and which are acceptable for now within established appetite and tolerance. This is where residual risk becomes especially important, because leaders are often less interested in the theoretical worst case than in understanding what exposure remains after current controls and realistic response options are taken into account. A strong assessment helps make those distinctions visible. For beginners, the crucial lesson is that prioritization is not about which issue feels most dramatic or receives the most attention in a meeting. It is about which risks most seriously threaten important objectives after considering context, consequence, and the real condition of the control environment. Communication is another core part of conducting a comprehensive assessment, because even the best analysis creates limited value if the results are not explained clearly to the people who need to act on them. Different audiences need different levels of detail. Technical teams may need specific findings and control observations. Business owners may need to understand process impact and treatment decisions, and leadership may need a concise view of major exposures, ownership, trends, and where residual risk exceeds comfort levels. The assessment should therefore produce outputs that are clear, organized, and tied to business meaning rather than buried in jargon. A common mistake is to deliver either too much detail for leaders or too little explanation for operational teams. Strong communication does not oversimplify the problem, but it does translate findings into the language each audience uses to make decisions. For a beginner, This is an important reminder that risk assessment is partly an analytical activity and partly a communication activity. Its value depends not just on discovering truth, but on helping others understand and act on it. Comprehensive assessment also requires stakeholder participation throughout the process, because no single function sees the full risk picture on its own. Business owners understand process criticality, customer commitments, timing, and acceptable workarounds. Technology teams understand dependencies, architecture limitations, support challenges, and failure points. Security, privacy, audit, continuity, and vendor oversight teams each add different insight into obligations, controls, incidents, and emerging concerns. When these perspectives are brought together thoughtfully, the assessment becomes more realistic and more credible. It is less likely to miss hidden dependencies or rely on assumptions held by only one group. For beginners, this shows why comprehensive work takes coordination. A rushed assessment done only by one technical team may identify visible issues, but it may still miss the true business consequence of a failure or the practical reasons a control is struggling. Comprehensive means looking widely enough and listening carefully enough that the final assessment reflects how the organization actually works rather than only how one group perceives it. Several common mistakes are worth avoiding because they can make an assessment look complete while leaving important gaps unresolved. One mistake is treating the assessment as a compliance exercise and rushing to finish documentation instead of seeking real understanding. Another is relying too heavily on tool output, which may reveal useful technical data but cannot by itself explain business importance, process weakness, or control ownership. Some organizations focus almost entirely on threat headlines and overlook the quieter risks created by third-party concentration, outdated processes, poor recovery readiness, or informal workarounds. Others conduct assessments once and then let the results age even as strategy, systems, vendors, and operating conditions change around them. These mistakes matter because comprehensive assessment is not a one-time ritual. It is an ongoing discipline of understanding the environment well enough to recognize where meaningful exposure exists now, not where it existed only at the moment the last report was completed. Strong assessments stay tied to current reality and drive follow-up rather than simply producing a polished document. When you pull everything together, conducting a comprehensive IT risk assessment becomes much easier to see as one connected process rather than a collection of separate review tasks. It begins with clear scope and strong context, gathers business and technical information, identifies critical assets and processes, examines threats and vulnerabilities, evaluates controls honestly, judges likelihood and impact thoughtfully, builds realistic scenarios, and prioritizes the risks that matter most to the organization's objectives. The result is not just a better report. The result is a stronger foundation for ownership, treatment, communication, and governance. For a new learner, the most important takeaway is that a comprehensive assessment helps the organization replace guesswork with disciplined understanding. It reveals not only where risk exists, but why it matters, what is already reducing it, and where leadership and operational teams need to focus next. That is why this activity is so central to effective risk management, because good decisions begin with a clear view of reality, and a well-conducted assessment is one of the best ways to create that view.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.